Hello everyone, and welcome to my story. This is Arthur Harrington, and today I'm going to share a tale that reshaped my entire world. It's about the day I was publicly shamed at my own son's wedding, and how I transformed that moment of deep humiliation into the most profound victory of my life. The magnificent chandeliers at Sterling Manor threw dancing patterns of light across the marble floors as I made one last adjustment to my silk tie. At 59, I had long understood that true elegance is a quiet statement, not a loud proclamation. My silver-gray hair was impeccably styled, and my bespoke navy suit spoke of classic refinement without needing to be flashy. This was, after all, my son Julian's wedding day, a day that was supposed to be a purely joyful occasion. I had made my entrance fashionably late, which was a habit of mine. The ceremony itself had been lovely. I watched my only child, Julian, marry his college sweetheart, Isabella Vance. She was 26 years old, blonde, and possessed a breathtaking level of ambition. I had always noticed that her smile never seemed to fully reach her eyes, but Julian was utterly captivated by her. I had learned many years ago that a father's quiet concerns are often unheard when his son is in the throes of love. The reception was in full swing by the time I made my way to the newlyweds' table. A string quartet was playing softly in the background, and the light catching the champagne flutes made them sparkle like liquid diamonds. I moved with a deliberate grace that had been instilled in me since my youth. Back straight, chin held high, my steps measured and full of purpose. "Congratulations, my boy," I said with warmth, clasping his shoulder. He looked so distinguished in his tuxedo, a striking image of his late mother. "And Isabella, welcome to our family." That was the moment everything shifted. Isabella's eyes narrowed as she scanned my appearance from head to toe. "Oh, you've finally decided to show up." Her voice held an edge I had never heard before. It was sharp and laced with condescension. "I was starting to worry you weren't going to make it to your own son's wedding." "Of course. I wouldn't miss this for the world. My mother wanted to meet you," Isabella cut in, gesturing towards a woman in a garish gold dress that was dripping with diamonds. "She's been dying to see what kind of man raised a son who can't even afford a proper ring." The remark was a sharp sting, but I held my composure. Julian shifted in his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable, but he remained silent. My wedding gift to them had been a discreet one, a trust fund designed to mature over time, not some ostentatious piece of jewelry or a luxury car. "I'm sure your mother is a wonderful woman," I replied, my voice perfectly even. Isabella let out a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "She is, unlike some people who arrive at a wedding looking like they can afford so much better." Her gaze raked over my classic suit with undisguised disgust. "Honestly, Julian warned me you weren't exactly rolling in money, but I thought you'd at least make an effort to look presentable at your own son's wedding." The blood rushed to my face, but I kept my voice unwavering. "I apologize if my appearance is a disappointment to you, Isabella." "Oh, it is." She stood up, her balance a little unsteady. It was clear she had been indulging in the champagne. "In fact, allow me to give you a little something to remember this day by." Before I had a chance to react, Isabella scooped up a large handful of the 3-tiered wedding cake vanilla with buttercream roses and shoved it directly into my face. The cold, sticky frosting dripped down my cheek as a wave of gasps spread through the guests. All conversation ceased. The string quartet's music faltered and died. "There," she announced, her voice loud enough for at least half the reception to hear. "Now your face matches your outfit, cheap and messy. Go on. I dare you to talk to my mother now, you beggar. Maybe she'll spare you some cash for a better suit." The silence in the room was absolute. I could feel the stare of every single person as the buttercream slid down my face and onto my silk tie. Julian was frozen in his seat, his mouth hanging open. I saw several guests with their phones out, undoubtedly capturing this humiliating moment to be forever immortalized on social media. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and began to calmly wipe the cake from my face. My hands were perfectly steady. When I finally spoke, my voice was under complete control. "How very thoughtful of you, my dear," I said, dabbing at the corners of my mouth. Although I must say, the cake is a touch too sweet for my palate. It was then that I heard a woman's voice from the other side of the room, sharp with disbelief. "Oh my God, that's Arthur Harrington. He owns Harrington Industries. The man is worth $3 billion. The woman pointing at me was Victoria Sterling. Her family was the owner of this very estate. We had crossed paths at charity functions years before, though I had always preferred to keep the extent of my wealth private. The color drained from Isabella's face so rapidly that for a second I thought she might collapse. All around us, whispers erupted and spread like wildfire. 3 billion. Harrington Industries, isn't that the steel empire? She just smashed cake in a billionaire's face. Did you hear what she called him? Julian finally found his voice. "Isabella, what have you done?" But I wasn't quite finished. I placed my hand gently on Isabella's shoulder, feeling her tremble under my touch. "Enjoy this moment, my dear," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Some of us prefer to wait for hours. I placed a kiss on Julian's forehead, gave a polite nod to the stunned crowd, and walked out of the reception with my head held high, leaving in my wake a room full of shocked whispers, and one very, very pale bride. As I drove home in my Bentley, a smile touched my lips at the sheer irony of the situation. My late wife always used to say, "Never fight fire with fire, Arthur. Smother it with silk." Tonight, I had practiced patience. But patience, as I was about to demonstrate, could be the most formidable weapon of them all. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to speak to anyone listening who has ever been made to feel overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. If you've ever been told you're too old to begin a new chapter, I want you to know that is a lie. Your story isn't finished, and there are still pages left for you to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is full of simple, powerful strategies to help you heal, rebuild your life, and fall in love with your journey again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. And please, remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because everyone deserves to hear stories that remind them of their own inner power. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The fine leather seats of my Bentley felt like a comforting embrace as I pulled away from Sterling Manor. In my rearview mirror, I could see guests spilling out onto the grand portico, their animated gestures leaving no doubt that their conversations were centered on the spectacle they had just witnessed. My phone was buzzing non-stop with calls and texts, but I chose to ignore them all. The drive to my estate was a 40-minute journey, along winding country roads, flanked by majestic, ancient oak trees. Usually I found this drive to be a peaceful one, but tonight my mind was racing with a kind of sharp clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The humiliation was still a fresh wound. I could almost taste the vanilla buttercream, but underneath that feeling was something else, something that felt surprisingly like anticipation. My home is situated on 200 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, a grand Georgian mansion that has been in my late wife's family for generations. As I passed through the wrought iron gates, motion-activated lights illuminated the circular driveway, bathing everything in a warm golden light. The fountains murmured serenely, and the sweet scent of my prized rose gardens filled the night air. Once inside, I went straight to my study. It's a room that has been the backdrop for countless major business deals and critical family decisions over the years. The walls are lined with first edition books and family portraits, including a beautiful one of my wife Eleanor, taken just months before she passed away 5 years ago. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved toward the antique safe concealed behind a false bookshelf. "Never fight fire with fire, Arthur," I whispered, repeating her favorite mantra as I dialed the combination. "Smother it with silk." The safe held things far more valuable than cash or jewelry. Inside were documents that represented decades of meticulous planning: wills, trust agreements, corporate holdings, insurance policies. Everything was flawlessly organized, a mix of Eleanor's elegant handwriting and my own detailed annotations. I poured myself a glass of Dom Perignon, the exact same vintage that had been served at the wedding, and settled into Eleanor's favorite leather armchair to review the family trust documents. Julian was my sole heir, but the trust had been constructed with Eleanor's sharp business instincts and my own inherent caution. It was filled with clauses within clauses, layers of protection built upon one another. As I read through the documents, my smile widened. The primary trust was indeed in Julian's name, but it came with very specific conditions. Any spouse would only have access to the income generated during the course of the marriage, not the principal amount. In the case of a divorce, the spouse would be entitled to nothing. And in the unlikely event that Julian predeceased me, everything would revert to blood relatives and a list of selected charities. But what truly caught my attention were the discretionary clauses sections that granted me, as the trust's originator, considerable control over disbursements in the event of extraordinary circumstances or threats to family harmony. I had nearly forgotten about those clauses, which Eleanor had insisted on, adding years ago when Julian was dating a woman we suspected was only interested in his wealth. "You never know," Eleanor had said with her typical foresight, "what kind of person might try to exploit our family's success." How right she had been. I spent the following 3 hours poring over every document, making notes, and carefully formulating a plan. By the time I was finished, the grand clock on the mantel chimed 3 in the morning, and I felt more energized than I had in months. Isabella Vance, now Isabella Harrington, had made a monumental miscalculation tonight. She had revealed her true character when she believed I was powerless. More importantly, she had done it in front of a room full of witnesses, creating a public narrative that would now follow her everywhere. But I had no intention of retaliating with the crude weapons she had used against me, humiliation and cruelty. No, my response would be far more refined, much more permanent. It would be a slow, deliberate unfolding, like a chess match played by a grandmaster against a complete novice. I went to bed that night with a small fleck of cake still caught in the cuff of my shirt, but I was smiling. Some people seek revenge that is hot and fast, but the truly devastating kind, the kind that leaves a lasting impact, requires patience, meticulous planning, and the sort of resources that Isabella had just discovered I possessed in great abundance. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of teaching my new daughter-in-law the critical difference between old money and new cruelty, and I planned to savor every single lesson. I awoke at dawn, as I always do, and started my day with meditation in the solarium. The morning sun filtered through the large glass panes, illuminating my collection of rare orchids, varieties that demanded patience and precise care to truly flourish. Much like revenge, I mused to myself as I watered a particularly stunning Paphiopedilum that had taken 3 years to bloom. By 8:00 a.m., I was in my study, dressed in a crisp cream-colored shirt and pearl gray trousers. My hair was neatly styled, and I wore a pair of simple gold cufflinks I had inherited from my own father. Understated, elegant, powerful. My first call was to Harrison Caldwell, a senior partner at Caldwell Clark and Associates, the law firm that had managed the Harrington family's legal affairs for over 3 decades. Harrison had been my roommate at Harvard and was one of the very few people who truly grasped the intricate nature of our family's financial structure. "Arthur," he answered on the first ring, "I heard what happened last night. Victoria Sterling called me at midnight. Apparently, the whole incident is already going viral online. Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine, Harrison. In fact, I'm calling because I need to make some adjustments to the family trust." There was a pause on the other end. "What kind of adjustments?" "The discretionary kind." Another pause, this one longer. Harrison knew me well enough to understand that when I used that particular tone, major changes were on the horizon. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. While I waited, I made my second call. This one was to my personal assistant, Diana, who has worked for me for 15 years and possesses an incredible ability to handle any task with absolute discretion. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she answered. "I've already seen the videos. Should I prepare a public statement?" "No, Diana, but I do need you to arrange a few things. First, I want a complete financial background check on Isabella Vance, now Harrington. I want everything: credit history, spending habits, any outstanding debt, her family's financial situation. I need to know where every dollar of hers comes from and where it goes." "Of course. Is there anything else?" "Yes. I want a list of every charity board, country club, and social organization where either she or her mother holds a membership or has an application pending. And I want the contact information for every single board chair and membership committee. I will have that information for you by tomorrow morning. One more thing, Diana. I'd like you to arrange a lunch with Patricia Cromwell for next week. It's time we caught up." Patricia Cromwell was the influential social columnist for Connecticut's most prestigious lifestyle magazine. She also happened to be an old friend from my university days and someone who deeply understood the importance of maintaining certain social standards. Harrison arrived at precisely 9:00 a.m., carrying his familiar leather briefcase and wearing the concerned expression that had served him so well in courtrooms for 4 decades. We sat down in my study with coffee served in Wedgwood china. Details were important, especially now. "Show me exactly what happened," he said, taking out his legal pad. I recounted the events of the previous evening with cold, clinical precision, watching as his eyebrows rose higher and higher with each detail of Isabella's behavior. "And this was all witnessed?" he asked. "By approximately 200 people, including several prominent families. Victoria Sterling, the Kensington family, the Fairfax clan, and, as you know, it's apparently being widely shared online." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "What exactly do you want to do, Arthur?" I slid the trust documents across the polished mahogany desk. "I want to activate the discretionary protection clauses. All of them." He began to flip through the pages, his sharp legal mind immediately processing the ramifications. "This would grant you significant control over Julian's inheritance. It would grant me the ability to protect our family's legacy from someone who has shown a fundamental lack of respect for our values. The threat to family harmony clause," he mused, reading directly from the document. "Yes, this could work. But Arthur, this is the nuclear option. Once we enact these changes, there's no turning back." I stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the rose gardens where Eleanor and I had planned our future together so many years ago. "Harrison, last night I was called a beggar by a woman who married my son for what she believed was his wealth. She humiliated me in front of our entire social circle because she thought I was powerless to do anything about it. That wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. And you intend to win it? I turned back to face him. I intend to teach her that in a war, the person with the most to lose is rarely the one with the most power. For the next 2 hours, we meticulously restructured the family trust with surgical precision. Every single disbursement would now require my personal approval. Julian would still have access to his trust income, a substantial sum that would allow him to live very comfortably. But any major purchases, investments, or gifts would have to be signed off on by me. More importantly, we added specific clauses related to spousal conduct. Any behavior deemed detrimental to the family's reputation or contrary to our family values could result in reduced distributions or a complete suspension of trust benefits. This is remarkably thorough, Harrison commented as he prepared the final documents for my signature. And perfectly legal. Eleanor was brilliant when she insisted on these protective measures. I signed each document with my Mont Blanc pen, the very same one I had used to sign my first major business contract 30 years ago. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. One final thing, I said as Harrison was preparing to leave. I want these changes to remain confidential for the time being. Julian doesn't need to be aware of them unless circumstances make it necessary. Understood. Though I should warn you, Isabella will likely find out about them eventually, especially if she attempts to access any significant funds. I smiled, an expression that had once made my competitors in the steel industry very nervous. Let her try. Some lessons are best learned through first-hand experience. After Harrison departed, I sat in my study, savoring the morning's work. Phase 1 was complete. Isabella had awakened something within me that had been dormant since Eleanor's passing. The thrill of strategic thinking, of playing a high-stakes game where the outcome was far from certain. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea and took it out to my private terrace, from where I could see the entire estate laid out before me. Somewhere out there, Isabella was likely just waking up, perhaps nursing a hangover from too much champagne, maybe even feeling a slight pang of guilt for her behavior, but not nearly guilty enough. Not yet. I took out my phone and, for the first time in months, scrolled through social media. The videos were, indeed, everywhere. Bridezilla humiliates father-in-law, doesn't know he's a billionaire. The comments were overwhelmingly brutal, but not in the way Isabella had intended. That poor man handled it with such incredible grace. Imagine being that cruel to your husband's father on your wedding day. Money can't buy you class, but it can certainly expose a lack of it. I smiled and put my phone away. The court of public opinion had already begun its deliberation. Now, it was time to let the jury reach its verdict. 3 weeks went by before I made my next move. During that period, I kept to my usual routine. Morning meditation, afternoon tea in the garden, and evenings spent reading in the library. To any outside observer, I was the same dignified widower I had been before the wedding. But beneath that serene exterior, I was meticulously gathering information and plotting my next steps with the patience of a master strategist. Diana's research had been both thorough and enlightening. Isabella Vance came from a middle-class family in Ohio. Her father was a regional insurance manager, and her mother was a real estate agent. They lived comfortably, but they were a world away from being wealthy. Isabella herself had racked up a significant amount of credit card debt during her college years and had been working as a marketing coordinator when she met Julian at a gallery opening 2 years prior. What was more revealing were her recent spending habits. In the months leading up to the wedding, she had been purchasing items that were far beyond her financial means. Designer handbags, luxury spa treatments, expensive pieces of jewelry. She was clearly operating on the assumption that she would soon have access to what she believed was Julian's vast inheritance. The irony was exquisite. My opportunity to act came on a Thursday afternoon when Julian called to invite me to lunch. We met at the Ocean View Club, a restaurant our family had favored for 3 generations. The dining room offered a stunning view of Long Island Sound, and on a clear day like this one, the water sparkled as if it were scattered with diamonds. Julian looked exhausted. I noticed it as we were shown to our usual table by the window. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there on his wedding day. "You look well, Father," he said, though his smile seemed strained. "I'm glad you were able to meet me." "Of course, my boy. How are you and Isabella settling into married life?" The question seemed to hang in the air for a moment too long. Julian fidgeted with his water glass before he finally answered. "It's been an adjustment," he said at last. "Marriage is more complicated than I ever expected." I nodded sympathetically. "All marriages require a period of adaptation. Your mother and I certainly had our share of challenges in the early days. Did you ever feel like you didn't really know Mom before you married her?" The question was very telling. I chose my words with care. "I think we all tend to present the best version of ourselves during courtship," I said gently. "The real person emerges over time, in the small, unguarded moments. How we treat service staff, how we react to disappointment, how we behave when we think no one of consequence is watching." Julian's hand stilled on his glass. "Yes, that's it, exactly." I let the silence linger, a technique I had perfected during years of business negotiations. People often fill a silence with the truth if you give them enough time. "Isabella has been different since the wedding," he finally admitted. "More demanding, more focused on things that just don't seem important to me. Things, money, status symbols. She's been talking non-stop about upgrading her car, completely redesigning the apartment, joining all these expensive clubs. When I told her we should be a bit more careful with our spending, she got angry and said I was being cheap, like..." He trailed off abruptly. "Like who, Julian?" I looked out at the water. "Like my father." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my expression perfectly neutral. "I see. I tried to explain to her that you're actually incredibly wealthy, but she just laughed and said you were probably just living off of life insurance money and would be broke within a few years." "And what did you say to that?" I told her she was wrong. He shrugged helplessly. "She said, you dress like you, shop at department stores, and you drive an old car." My Bentley was 3 years old, and my classic sense of style had been cultivated over decades. But I could understand how someone obsessed with flashy displays of wealth might misinterpret understated elegance. "What else is troubling you, Julian?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "She's been going out more at night. Girls' nights, she calls them. But she comes home very late and gets defensive when I ask where she's been. And I've found charges on the credit card statement that I don't recognize. Expensive restaurants, nightclubs. When I ask her about them, she accuses me of being controlling." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Marriage requires trust, my boy, but it also requires transparency. I know, it's just." He looked at me with the same expression he used to have as a child when he had broken something valuable and was afraid to confess. "I'm starting to think I married someone I don't actually know." The admission hung between us like a solemn confession. I could have offered him words of comfort, reassured him that all marriages go through difficult phases, but I chose a different approach. "Trust your instincts, Julian," I said gently. "You've always had excellent judgment when it comes to people. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore what your heart is telling you." We finished our lunch, discussing safer topics. His work, my plans for the garden, the upcoming holidays. but I could see that the seeds of doubt had firmly taken root in his mind. He was beginning to question not only Isabella's behavior, but also her motivations for marrying him in the first place. After he left, I remained at the table, sipping my tea and watching the sailboats drift across the Sound. I hadn't lied to him. He did have good judgment about people. He had always been able to see through insincere friends and social climbers. But love, as his mother used to say, could make even the wisest person temporarily blind. The blindness, however, was beginning to fade. That evening, I called Patricia Cromwell to confirm our lunch for the following week. Patricia's column, Society's Mirror, was required reading for everyone who mattered in Connecticut's social hierarchy. A mere mention in her column could make or break a reputation, influence club memberships, and sway charity board appointments. "I'm so looking forward to our lunch," Patricia said, "and I must say you handle that dreadful business at the Sterling wedding with remarkable grace. The whole thing was absolutely shocking." "Thank you, Patricia. It was certainly an unexpected turn of events. I hope you won't be offended if I ask you about it during lunch. I'm working on a piece about the importance of maintaining one's dignity in challenging social situations. You would be the perfect example to feature." "Of course," I agreed, though we both knew that wasn't her primary interest. After I hung up the phone, I went to my study and took out a leather-bound journal, one of many I had kept over the years to document important business decisions and personal reflections. Tonight's entry was brief. "The foundation has been laid. Julian is beginning to see the truth for himself, which is far more powerful than any revelation I could provide. Some truths must be discovered, not told. Patience remains my greatest weapon." I closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer, alongside similar volumes that dated back to my earliest days in business. Each one was a record of the careful planning and strategic thinking that had helped build the Harrington fortune. This particular journal, I suspected, would document the most satisfying campaign of my life. Patricia Cromwell hadn't changed much in the 30 years since our university days. Her auburn hair was now professionally colored to conceal the gray, and her figure was diligently maintained with twice-weekly Pilates. But her sharp eyes and even sharper instincts were exactly as I remembered them. We met at Les Bernardins in Manhattan, a neutral ground where we could speak freely without the risk of running into anyone from our Connecticut social circles. Patricia ordered the Dover sole. I opted for the lobster salad. We spent the first course catching up on mutual friends and family news, but I could see her journalistic instincts stirring just beneath her pleasant smile. "Now then," she said as our main courses arrived, "tell me about this new daughter-in-law of yours." "Isabella is spirited," I said carefully, using the same measured tone I had with Julian. "She has very strong opinions about how things ought to be done." Patricia leaned forward. "Arthur, I've known you for 3 decades. You don't do anything without careful thought, and that includes agreeing to have this lunch. What is really going on?" I smiled at her directness. It was one of the qualities that had made her such a successful columnist. "I'm concerned about certain social standards being compromised. Things like the way people treat those they perceive as less fortunate, the importance of maintaining grace under pressure, the difference between confidence and cruelty." Patricia's pen glided across her notepad with practiced ease. "Are we talking about anyone in particular?" "I'm simply making an observation that some people mistake kindness for weakness and assume that quiet dignity is a sign of a lack of power or resources. And how do you believe such misunderstandings should be corrected?" I took a sip of my Chablis before I answered. "I believe that society has its own mechanisms for maintaining balance. Good behavior is rewarded. Poor behavior has consequences. The challenge is ensuring that the right people have the right information to make informed decisions." Patricia understood me perfectly. By the time we finished our lunch, she had all the material she needed for her column, though she would frame it as a thoughtful piece on the importance of preserving social graces in an increasingly coarse world. More importantly, she now had a very clear picture of the kind of person Isabella Pierce Harrington was. The column was published the following Thursday with the headline, "Grace Under Fire, a Masterclass in Dignity." While my name was never explicitly mentioned, anyone who had been at the wedding would instantly recognize the incident Patricia described with such eloquent disapproval. The article quickly became one of her most shared columns of the year. But the real work was happening behind the scenes. Over the next few weeks, I began to subtly reconnect with the membership committees of various organizations where Isabella had either applied or expressed an interest in joining. My approach was always indirect. I simply renewed old friendships, started attending charity luncheons I had previously declined, and quietly resumed my place in the social circles I had kept a lower profile in since Eleanor's death. The Greenwich Country Club was the first target. Isabella had submitted a membership application sponsored by Julian, who had been a member since his college days. I happened to run into Margaret Fairfax, the chair of the membership committee, at a hospital fundraiser. "Arthur, how wonderful to see you out and about again," Margaret said warmly. "We've missed seeing you at the club events." "I'm thinking of becoming more socially active again," I replied. Eleanor always said that isolation wasn't healthy, and I believe she was right. We chatted for a bit about mutual friends and upcoming events before Margaret mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "I believe your new daughter-in-law has applied for membership." "Has she? How interesting." "We're still in the process of reviewing applications, of course. The committee takes character references very seriously." I nodded thoughtfully. "Character is so vital in maintaining the club's standards. I am confident you will make the right decision." The conversation lasted no more than 10 minutes. But Margaret left with a crystal-clear understanding of my feelings regarding Isabella's application. 2 weeks later, Isabella received a polite rejection letter, citing current membership capacity limitations. The Harbor Yacht Club followed a similar pattern, as did the Junior League Auxiliary Board. Each rejection was delivered with impeccable politeness and a plausible excuse that had nothing to do with character concerns, but the cumulative effect was devastating for someone whose entire plan had been to climb the social ladder through her marriage. The Art Gallery Board was particularly satisfying. Isabella had been attending several openings, clearly trying to position herself as a patron of the arts. When she applied for a spot on the junior board of the Metropolitan Arts Council, her application was reviewed by a committee that included 3 of my longtime acquaintances. "I just don't think she's quite the right fit for our vision," Elizabeth Kensington confided to me over tea. "There's something rather grasping about her. She seems more interested in being seen as cultured than in actually supporting the arts." "How unfortunate," I murmured. "Though I suppose not everyone understands that true patronage requires genuine passion, not just social ambition." "Exactly. You understand these things, Arthur. You always have." Meanwhile, Diana's research had uncovered another interesting detail. Isabella's credit card debt was growing at an alarming rate. The expensive purchases had continued after the wedding, all funded by credit cards in her own name. She was clearly operating under the expectation that access to the family money would eventually become available to her money that, unbeknownst to her, was no longer accessible in the way she had assumed. The pressure was clearly starting to get to her. Julian mentioned during our weekly phone calls that Isabella had become increasingly irritable about their social invitations, or more accurately, the lack of them. "Doors that she expected to swing open are remaining firmly shut," he told me during one conversation. "She keeps insisting that people are snubbing us. She thinks it's because of what happened at the wedding, but I don't understand why that would matter so much. It was just one incident." "Some people have long memories," I said gently. And first impressions can be very difficult to overcome, but it's affecting her so much. She's been drinking more, and she gets angry over the smallest things. Last night she threw a crystal vase across the room because an invitation she was expecting didn't arrive. I felt a flicker of genuine concern for my son, mixed with a sense of satisfaction at Isabella's mounting frustration. The social freeze was working exactly as I had intended, creating a pressure cooker that would eventually force her true nature to reveal itself. Perhaps she needs some time to adjust her expectations, I suggested. Maybe, though I'm starting to wonder if her expectations were realistic in the first place. Another seed of doubt had taken root and was beginning to grow. That evening, I stood on my terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance, I could see the lights of the yacht club, where Isabella would never be welcomed. The country club, where she would never play tennis. The social circles, where she would forever remain an outsider. Some people mistake kindness for weakness, I thought, recalling my conversation with Patricia. But they rarely make that mistake twice. The first phase of my campaign was complete. Isabella's social ambitions were in ruins, her expectations shattered against the invisible but impenetrable walls of old money and established relationships. But I was far from finished. True revenge, like a fine wine, needed time to reach its full potential. And I had all the time in the world. By the time autumn arrived, Isabella's frustration had evolved into full-blown paranoia. Julian reported that she had become obsessed with social media, constantly monitoring who was attending events she hadn't been invited to, and taking screenshots of photos from gatherings she'd been excluded from. The woman who had once radiated confidence to the point of cruelty was now seeing slights and conspiracies everywhere she looked. This made the next phase of my plan considerably easier to execute. The key to successful manipulation, as I had learned during my years in the business world, is to let your target's own insecurities do most of the heavy lifting. I didn't need to spread malicious gossip about Isabella. I simply needed to ensure that her own behavior created the narrative I wanted. It began with Ashley Monroe, a 24-year-old socialite whose primary occupation was attending luncheons and whose greatest talent was spreading gossip. Ashley was the type of person who could make or break reputations simply by being seen at the right gatherings. She was also deeply impressed by wealth and was desperate for acceptance from the older, more established society figures. I made a point of encountering Ashley at a charity fashion show, one of the few public events I had started attending again. She approached me during the intermission, her eyes shining with a kind of calculated friendliness that screamed social ambition. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Ashley Monroe. I just wanted to tell you how much I admired the way you handled that awful situation at the Sterling wedding. You were absolutely gracious. Thank you, my dear. Though I prefer not to dwell on such unpleasant incidents, of course. But still, the way you just walked away with such dignity, I could never have managed that." I studied her for a moment, recognizing something useful in her eager-to-please demeanor. "You know, Ashley, I believe you might be exactly the person I need." "What do you mean?" "I'm looking for someone to help me re-enter the social scene. Someone young and energetic who knows all the right people. Would you be interested in coordinating some small gatherings for me? Nothing extravagant, just intimate dinner parties for interesting people." Ashley's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. The opportunity to plan events for Arthur Harrington, to be associated with one of Connecticut's wealthiest families, was beyond her wildest social climbing dreams. "I would be honored," she breathed. "Wonderful. We'll start with something small next month, perhaps 8 people. Just a quiet dinner party to celebrate my return to entertaining." What Ashley didn't realize was that she was about to become my most effective weapon against Isabella. The dinner party took place 3 weeks later, in my formal dining room, illuminated by Waterford crystal chandeliers and set with spode china that had been in Eleanor's family for generations. The guest list was carefully curated. 6 people who were pillars of Connecticut society, plus Ashley and myself. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the Dom Perignon, and by the time the 3rd course was served, I had steered the discussion exactly where I wanted it. "I must say, Arthur," commented Victoria Sterling, "it's wonderful to have you entertaining again. We've truly missed your gatherings." "Thank you, Victoria. I've missed them as well, though I must admit I'm being more selective with my guest list these days." "Oh?" This came from Caroline Payton, whose husband sat on half the charity boards in the state. "I've learned that not everyone appreciates the subtleties of proper social interaction," I said with a faint smile. "Some people seem to believe that marrying into a family automatically grants them access to all social privileges, regardless of their behavior." Ashley leaned forward eagerly. "Are you talking about people who don't understand social etiquette?" "Precisely. For instance, there are those who assume that loud criticism of others will somehow elevate their own status, or who mistake aggression for confidence." The table murmured in agreement. These were people who had been raised on the principles of discretion and grace, the very principles Isabella had violated so spectacularly. "It's particularly sad," I continued, "when someone is so clearly out of their depth but refuses to learn from those who could guide them. Pride, I suppose, prevents them from accepting help." "How exhausting that must be for the family," Caroline observed. "Indeed, though one can only hope that time and experience will provide the education that their upbringing apparently did not." By the end of the evening, Ashley was practically vibrating with excitement. She had been included in an intimate gathering of Connecticut's elite, had been privy to delicious gossip about unnamed but clearly identifiable individuals, and had been positioned as my unofficial social coordinator. More importantly, she now had stories to share. Over the following weeks, Ashley became my unwitting ambassador, spreading carefully crafted narratives about exclusivity, social standards, and the importance of proper behavior. She began hosting her own smaller gatherings, where she could share insider knowledge about why certain people were no longer welcome in certain circles. The genius of this strategy was that Ashley never mentioned Isabella by name. She simply discussed, in general terms, the consequences of poor social judgment and the importance of upholding standards. But anyone who had witnessed the wedding incident knew exactly who she was talking about. Isabella, meanwhile, was spiraling. She had started attending public events where she couldn't be excluded: art gallery openings, charity fundraisers, public lectures. But her desperation was palpable, and desperation has a particular scent that sophisticated people can detect from across a room. "She's become so intense," Julian confided during one of our dinners. "Last week, she cornered Patricia Cromwell at a museum opening and demanded to know why she wasn't being invited to better events." Patricia was polite, of course, but I could see she was very uncomfortable. "That must have been embarrassing for you." "It was mortifying. And when I tried to talk to Isabella about it afterward, she got angry at me, saying I should have supported her more. But what was I supposed to do? You can't demand social invitations." "No," I agreed. "They must be earned." The credit card situation was also getting worse. Diana's monthly report showed that Isabella's debt had ballooned to over 60 spread across multiple cards. She was maintaining her lavish lifestyle by borrowing, clearly expecting that access to the family money would eventually resolve her financial problems. What she didn't know was that every significant purchase now required my approval under the discretionary clauses Harrison had so cleverly activated. When she applied for a joint credit card with Julian, the application was denied due to the trust's restrictions on family debt obligations. I don't understand, Julian told me after another tense conversation with his wife. The bank mentioned something about trust provisions that prevent joint financial obligations. What does that even mean? It means the trust is protecting your interests, I said carefully. Your mother was very concerned about fortune hunters who might try to access our family's money through marriage. Fortune hunters? Julian looked stricken. You don't think Isabella? I placed my hand gently on his arm. I think your mother was wise to include those protections, regardless of the circumstances. Trusts are designed to preserve wealth across generations, not to insult anyone's intentions. But the seed had been planted, and I could see it taking root alongside all the others I had sown over the past few months. The final piece of this phase fell into place at Thanksgiving. Isabella had been planning an elaborate dinner party to showcase her new role as the Harrington family hostess. She had sent invitations to all the right people, ordered expensive flowers and catering, and planned a menu that would have impressed a 5-star chef. The problem was, almost no one showed up. Julian called me the day after Thanksgiving, his voice hollow with embarrassment. Father, I don't know what happened. We had RSVPs from 20 people, but only 6 came. Isabella spent thousands of dollars on that dinner, and we ended up with enough food for an army and almost no guests. Perhaps people had other commitments, I suggested gently. But they confirmed they were coming. Some of them didn't even bother to call and cancel. They just didn't show up. Isabella was humiliated. She's been in our bedroom crying for 2 days. I felt a brief moment of something that might have been sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of buttercream frosting dripping down my face. I'm sorry it was such a disappointment, my boy. She keeps saying that people are deliberately avoiding us, that there's some kind of conspiracy against her. But that's crazy, right? People don't actually do things like that. The innocence in his voice was heartbreaking. My son had been raised with immense privilege, but also with great kindness. He simply couldn't comprehend the intricate social warfare that his father had mastered over decades in both business and society. People can be unpredictable, I said diplomatically. Perhaps next time, a smaller, more intimate gathering would be better. But we both knew there wouldn't be a next time. Isabella's reputation as a hostess was finished before it had even begun, destroyed by her own behavior and my careful orchestration of the consequences. That night, I sat in my study reviewing Diana's latest report on Isabella's activities. The picture it painted was of a woman who was increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate, and increasingly prone to public displays of frustration that only served to further damage her reputation. The social freeze was complete. Isabella had been effectively exiled from the circles she had so desperately hoped to conquer, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, inexorable pressure of disapproval and exclusion. But I wasn't finished. Isolation was just the beginning. The next phase would require Isabella to destroy herself completely, and I wouldn't have to lift a single finger to make it happen. Some lessons, after all, could only be taught through experience. December brought the first true test of my carefully laid plans. Isabella, desperate to understand why her social ambitions had so completely crumbled, hired a lawyer to investigate her legal rights as a member of the Harrington family. It was the exact move I had been anticipating, and the one that would finally expose just how little power she actually possessed. The lawyer she selected was Jonathan Moss, a mid-tier attorney known for his aggressive tactics in matrimonial law. He was not the kind of sophisticated legal mind who would grasp the subtle complexities of family trust structures. but he was precisely the type who would give Isabella the answers she wanted to hear, at least initially. Julian called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with stress. "Father, Isabella has hired a lawyer. She wants to understand her rights concerning the family trust. That is certainly her prerogative," I said calmly, though my heart was racing with anticipation. "What exactly is she hoping to discover?" "She thinks. She believes that you've somehow blocked her access to the family money. Eleanor's trust is ironclad, and every provision was legally sound at the time of its implementation. How long will this review take?" "I've sent him the relevant documents. Based on what I've provided, I would estimate he'll need about a week to realize that his client has absolutely no legal standing. And then he'll have to deliver some very disappointing news." I felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. The trust that Eleanor had so carefully constructed was about to prove its worth in ways neither of us had ever fully anticipated. The revelation came on a Friday afternoon. Julian arrived at my house unannounced, looking haggard and utterly defeated. I found him standing in my foyer, still wearing his overcoat, staring up at the family portrait that dominated the entrance hall. "She knows," he said without any preamble. "Knows what, my boy?" "About the trust, about the restrictions, about all of it." I led him into the library, where a fire was crackling in the marble fireplace. He slumped into Eleanor's old leather armchair and buried his face in his hands. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. "Her lawyer called this morning. Apparently, the trust is structured in a way that spouses have virtually no rights to the family assets. She can't access the principal, can't make major financial decisions, can't even co-sign for significant loans without your approval. Your mother was very thorough in protecting the family legacy." Julian looked up at me, his eyes reminding me so painfully of Eleanor's. "But it's more than that, isn't it? The discretionary clauses. They give you control over almost everything. If you decided I was making poor choices, you could essentially cut off all family support. I chose my words with great care. The trust was designed to protect against threats to family harmony and reputation. Your mother believed that preserving our values was just as important as preserving our wealth. And you think Isabella threatens those values?" It wasn't a question. Julian had finally connected all the dots I had been laying out for months. "I think your mother would have had serious concerns about someone who publicly humiliated her husband and called him a beggar." Julian flinched as if I had struck him. "You've known all along about the restrictions, about what this would mean for her. You've been watching her fail, knowing she had no real access to the family money. I've been protecting what your mother spent her lifetime building. By destroying my marriage?" The accusation hung in the air between us like a sword. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of doubt, a paternal instinct to comfort my son, no matter the cost. Then I remembered the taste of vanilla buttercream and the sound of derisive laughter as I walked away from my own son's wedding, my dignity in tatters. "Your marriage is destroying itself," I said quietly. "I am simply ensuring that when it does, our family's legacy remains intact." Julian stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing everything: the social rejections, the financial restrictions, the carefully orchestrated isolation of his wife. "She accused me of knowing," he said finally, "of being part of some conspiracy against her. When I told her I had no idea about the trust provisions, she called me a liar." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I knew you were wealthy, but I never concerned myself with the details of my inheritance because I never expected it to be relevant during your lifetime. That I married her because I loved her, not because of what she might gain from our family." "And how did she respond to that?" Julian's laugh was bitter. "She accused me of being naive, said that no one marries into a billionaire family without understanding the financial implications. She actually admitted that she had done her research, that she knew exactly what she was supposed to gain by marrying me. The admission must have been devastating for him. The revelation that his wife had viewed their marriage as a business transaction rather than a love story. You deserve better than that. Did I? Or did I deserve exactly what I got for being foolish enough to ignore all the warning signs? We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the crackling of the fire as shadows danced on the walls. Finally, Julian spoke again. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. I want my wife to love me for who I am, not for what she thinks I can provide for her. But I'm beginning to realize that might not be possible. The defeat in his voice was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. Some illusions must be completely shattered before reality can take their place. Love that is built on false foundations rarely survives the truth, I said gently. Julian nodded slowly. She's talking about going back to Ohio for Christmas. To think about our future, she says. But I think she's really going there to discuss her options with her family. That might be for the best. Sometimes distance can provide clarity. After Julian left, I poured myself a glass of wine and returned to the library. The revelation phase was complete. Isabella now understood the true scope of her situation, and more importantly, so did Julian. But understanding and acceptance are two very different things. Isabella was facing the complete collapse of everything she had believed her marriage would provide, and desperate people often make dangerous choices. I suspected the final act of this drama was about to begin, and it would be the most difficult one for everyone involved. But like a surgeon removing a malignant tumor, sometimes the most painful treatment is the only one that can save what matters most. I raised my glass in a silent toast to Eleanor's portrait above the fireplace. Her foresight was about to be vindicated in the most complete way imaginable. Isabella didn't go to Ohio for Christmas. Instead, she embarked on what can only be described as a campaign of self-destruction, so thorough that I couldn't have orchestrated it better myself if I had tried. It started with shopping. A lot of shopping. Diana's report detailed a spending spree that bordered on manic. Designer handbags, jewelry, shoes, clothing, all charged to credit cards that were already at their limits. When those were declined, she opened new accounts, using her status as a Harrington family member to secure additional credit. The irony was exquisite. She was leveraging the family name to accumulate a mountain of debt that the family trust would never permit Julian to help her repay. Julian called me on New Year's Eve, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's completely lost control," he said. "Yesterday, I found shopping bags hidden in our closet. Thousands of dollars worth of things she can't possibly afford. When I confronted her about it, she claimed it was an investment in our social image. An investment. She's convinced that if she just looks successful enough, people will eventually accept her back into their circles. She seems to think her social problems are just a temporary misunderstanding that can be fixed with the right wardrobe." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "And how are you handling this?" "I'm not sure I'm handling it. She's been drinking more, a lot more. Last week, she showed up to a lunch with the wives of my business associates and was clearly intoxicated by the time dessert was served. Jennifer Walsh called me afterward to check if everything was all right." Jennifer Walsh was the wife of Julian's business partner, a woman whose opinion carried significant weight in their professional circles. If Isabella was embarrassing herself in front of Jennifer, word would spread quickly through the business community. "I am sorry, my boy. That must have been deeply embarrassing." It was mortifying. And when I tried to talk to Isabella about it, she accused me of being ashamed of her. She said that if I really loved her, I would find a way to give her the lifestyle she deserves. The lifestyle she deserves? Unlimited access to family money, a house in the Hamptons, memberships to all the exclusive clubs. She has a whole list of things she considers her basic requirements for being married to a Harrington. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking, even by Isabella's standards. She had gone from attempting to climb the social ladder to demanding that it be lowered to meet her. But the shopping and drinking weren't the worst of it. That honor belonged to what Diana discovered during her routine monitoring of Isabella's activities. "Mr. Harrington," Diana said during our weekly meeting, "I need to show you something concerning." She handed me a series of photographs taken at various Manhattan nightclubs over the past month. In each one, Isabella was clearly visible, laughing and dancing with groups of people I didn't recognize. More troubling were the photos that showed her in intimate conversation with men who were definitely not her husband. "She's been going out 3 or 4 nights a week," Diana reported. "Always to upscale venues in Manhattan. Always spending money she doesn't have. The credit card receipts show bar tabs of several $100s per night. Is Julian aware of this?" "I don't believe so." She tells him she's attending cultural events or meeting with potential social contacts. But these venues, Diana shook her head, these are not the places one goes to make connections in Connecticut society. I studied the photographs more carefully. Isabella looked different in them, harder, somehow more desperate. The elegant facade she had maintained during their courtship had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Continue your monitoring," I instructed, "but be discreet. We don't want to create a situation that could compromise Julian unnecessarily." The situation was beginning to escalate beyond my careful control, and that made me nervous. I had wanted to expose Isabella's true nature, not drive her to complete self-destruction. There was a difference between justice and cruelty, and I had never intended to cross that line. My concerns proved to be justified when Julian called me at midnight on a Thursday, his voice trembling with emotion. "Father, I need your help." "What's wrong?" "Isabella. She didn't come home tonight. She said she was going to a museum lecture. But when I called the museum, they told me there was no event scheduled. I've been trying to reach her for hours." "Have you contacted the police?" "Not yet. I was hoping. Could you ask Diana to help find her? She seems to know how to locate people." Within 2 hours, Diana had tracked Isabella to a trendy nightclub in Soho, where security cameras showed her leaving at 1:30 a.m. with a man I didn't recognize. She didn't return home until the following afternoon, offering no explanation beyond a vague claim that she had stayed at a friend's apartment because she was too tired to drive. The lie was so transparent that even Julian, who had been making excuses for his wife for months, could no longer ignore it. "She's having an affair," he told me over dinner the following week. "I know it. She knows. I know it. But she keeps denying it. What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront her, to demand the truth. But another part of me..." He trailed off, staring at his untouched plate. "Another part of you..." "What?" "Another part of me wonders if I even care anymore." Is that a terrible thing to say? I feel like I've been trying to save a marriage to someone who doesn't actually exist. The woman I fell in love with was kind, ambitious in a healthy way, and genuinely interested in building a life together. This person, he gestured helplessly. I don't even know who this person is. The sadness in his voice was heartbreaking, but it was also liberating. Julian was finally ready to see the truth that had been obvious to everyone else for months. People show us who they really are when they're under pressure, I said gently. Perhaps this is simply who Isabella has always been, and you're just seeing it clearly for the first time. Then I've made a terrible mistake. Not a mistake, my boy. A learning experience. The question now is what you're going to do with what you've learned. But Julian, wasn't ready to answer that question yet. Like many people who are faced with the collapse of their fundamental assumptions, he needed more time to process the reality of his situation. Isabella, meanwhile, was providing him with plenty of additional evidence to consider. The following weekend, she attended a charity gala without him, claiming he was too busy with work to accompany her. According to Ashley Monroe's breathless report, delivered during one of our regular coffee meetings, Isabella had consumed far too much champagne and made a scene when she wasn't seated at one of the premium tables. She actually approached Mrs. Peyton and demanded to know why she wasn't considered worthy of a better placement, Ashley whispered with barely contained glee. Mrs. Peyton was mortified. Security had to escort her out. The incident would be reported in Patricia Cromwell's column the following week, though Isabella's name would be discreetly omitted. But everyone who mattered would know exactly who had violated such basic social protocols. By February, Isabella's public behavior had become so erratic that people were beginning to whisper about interventions and mental health concerns. The irony wasn't lost on me. In her desperate attempt to force her way into society's upper echelons, she had made herself a cautionary tale about the dangers of social climbing without substance. But I took no pleasure in watching her spiral. What had begun as a measured quest for justice had morphed into something uglier, more desperate. Isabella was destroying herself with a thoroughness that exceeded even my most ambitious plans for revenge. Perhaps it was time to consider mercy, or perhaps it was already too late for such considerations. The end came, as these things often do, at the most public moment imaginable. It was the annual Heart Foundation Gala at the Waldorf Astoria, Connecticut's premier charity event of the spring social season. I had purchased a table, as I did every year, and invited a carefully selected group of companions, Victoria Sterling, the Kensington family, and several other pillars of proper society. Julian had declined to attend, citing work commitments, though I suspected he simply couldn't bear the thought of managing Isabella's behavior at such a high-profile event. Isabella, however, had other plans. I was enjoying the cocktail reception, discussing the evening's auction items with Victoria, when I spotted her across the room. She was wearing a dress that likely cost more than most people's monthly salary, red silk, figure-hugging with jewelry that sparkled intensely under the chandeliers. She looked beautiful, certainly, but her attire was entirely inappropriate for a charity gala where understatement is considered the highest form of elegance. "Is that your daughter-in-law?" Victoria asked, following my gaze. "Yes, it is. She looks determined." That was one way to put it. Isabella was moving through the crowd with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. Her smile was too bright, her laugh too loud. I could see the subtle shifts in the room as people noticed her approach, the way conversations faltered, how groups seemed to close ranks almost imperceptibly. She made her way to our group with the inevitability of a force of nature. "Arthur," she said, ere kissing my cheek with theatrical affection, "how wonderful to see you here. You look lovely." "Thank you, Isabella. How nice that you could attend." Up close, I could see the telltale signs I had learned to recognize over the past months. The slight tremor in her hands, the overly bright eyes that suggested she had been drinking during the cocktail hour, the brittle quality to her smile that spoke of barely controlled desperation. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, her voice carrying just a bit too much volume. "After all, charitable giving is so important for families like ours. Don't you think, Victoria?" Victoria Sterling, who had witnessed Isabella's humiliation of me at the wedding, simply nodded politely and excused herself to speak with someone across the room. But Isabella wasn't finished. As the evening progressed, she seemed to grow more agitated. During dinner, I watched her work her way around the room, approaching various tables, and attempting to insert herself into conversations. Each interaction was a little shorter than the last, and each rejection, for they were rejections, however politely delivered, seemed to fuel her mounting frustration. The breaking point came during the auction portion of the evening. I had just successfully bid on a week at a Tuscan villa, donating 50-0 to the Heart Foundation, when Isabella suddenly stood up from her table across the room. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the polite applause that had followed my bid. "Excuse me, but I have something to say." The auctioneer paused, microphone in hand, clearly unsure how to handle this unexpected interruption. Around the ballroom, conversation stopped as 500 of Connecticut's most influential people turned to stare at the woman in the red dress. "I want everyone here to know," Isabella continued, swaying slightly as she spoke, "that I am Isabella Harrington, Mrs. Julian Harrington, and despite what some people in this room might think, I belong here just as much as anyone else." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was beyond a social faux pas. It was a complete violation of every unspoken rule that governed events like this. "Furthermore," she said, her voice growing louder and more slurred, "I am tired of being treated like some kind of social pariah just because certain people," her eyes found mine across the room, "can't accept that their sons have grown up and made their own choices about who to marry." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room shifting between Isabella and me, waiting to see how this unprecedented scene would unfold. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my navy Armani suit, and walked calmly to the podium where the auctioneer stood frozen. Without asking for permission, I took the microphone from his hand. "Thank you, Isabella," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I appreciate your passion for family relationships." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience. "But if I may," I continued, "I would like to remind everyone why we are here tonight. We are gathered to support the Heart Foundation, an organization that has funded life-saving cardiac research for over 30 years. The applause started tentatively at first, then grew stronger as people recognized that I was attempting to salvage the evening's dignity. "In my experience," I said, looking directly at Isabella, "the strongest hearts are often the quietest ones. They don't need to announce their worth. They simply demonstrate it through their actions, their consistency, and their commitment to others." The applause was building now, and I could see Isabella's face reddening as she realized that her dramatic gesture had backfired completely. Tonight, this room is filled with people who embody those values. People who understand that true strength comes not from demanding recognition, but from earning it. People who know that charity, like love, is something you give freely, not something you use to purchase acceptance. The standing ovation began at my table and spread throughout the room like wildfire. 500 people were on their feet, applauding not just my words, but the grace with which I had handled an impossible situation. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of it all, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and fled from the ballroom, leaving behind a room full of people who would remember this moment for years to come. I handed the microphone back to the auctioneer, who managed to restore order and continue with the evening's program. But the damage was done not to me, but to Isabella. She had publicly revealed herself to be exactly what I had always known she was. Someone who confused volume with strength and drama with dignity. The videos began appearing on social media within hours. "Billionaire's grace under pressure," read one headline. "How to handle a public meltdown with class," read another. By morning, the incident had been shared thousands of times, with commentary that universally praised my composure and criticized Isabella's behavior. Julian called me at 7:00 a.m., his voice hollow with shame. "I saw the videos," he said simply. "I am so sorry, Father, for everything." You have nothing to apologize for, my boy, don't I? I brought her into our family. I ignored all the warning signs because I thought I was in love. I let her humiliate you, not once, but twice. Now, you have learned something important about the person you married. That's not a failure. It's wisdom gained through experience. There was a long pause. She hasn't come home. Do you want her to? Another pause, even longer this time. No, he said finally. I don't think I do. The transformation was complete. The son who had been too blinded by infatuation to see his wife's true nature was finally ready to acknowledge what everyone else had known for months. Justice, I reflected, has many faces, but the most satisfying kind is always self-inflicted. Spring came early that year, and with it, a sense of renewal that I hadn't felt since Eleanor passed away. The daffodils in my garden bloomed magnificently, and I spent my mornings tending to them while sipping coffee from my favorite Limoges cup. Small pleasures that reminded me that life could still offer beauty after difficult chapters. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in April, delivered by Harrison Caldwell himself rather than by a courier. He found me in my rose garden, where I was pruning the climbing roses that would soon burst into their full glory. It's finished, he said simply, handing me the leather portfolio. I set down my pruning shears and opened the documents, scanning the settlement terms with the same meticulous attention I had once given to corporate contracts. The prenuptial agreement that Isabella had so carelessly signed 2 years ago had proven its worth. She would receive nothing beyond what she had brought into the marriage. The family trust remained intact, untouched by her grasping ambitions. She signed without any contest? I asked. Her lawyer advised her that any challenge would be futile and expensive. Given her current financial situation, she couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle anyway. I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. Where is she now? Back in Ohio, from what I understand, living with her parents while she reassesses her options. The woman who had called me a beggar was now dependent on her middle-class parents for basic support. The irony was not lost on me, though I took no particular pleasure in it. Revenge, I had discovered, was most satisfying when it was earned rather than merely inflicted. And Julian? He seems relieved. Honestly, I think the past few months showed him exactly what kind of person he had married. The drinking, the spending, the public scenes, it all painted a rather clear picture. Indeed, it had. Isabella had destroyed herself more thoroughly than I ever could have managed, revealing her true character with a precision that made my own machinations seem almost unnecessary in retrospect. That evening, Julian came for dinner, our first private meal together since the divorce proceedings began. He looked younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Over my cook's famous coq au vin, we talked about his work and his plans for the future, carefully avoiding any discussion of his failed marriage. It wasn't until dessert that he finally broached the subject that had been hanging between us for months. "I know what you did," he said quietly, setting down his coffee cup, my hand stilled on my napkin. "What do you mean?" "The social exile, the trust restrictions, the way you systematically dismantled her support network. I know it wasn't just a coincidence. For a moment, I considered denying it, maintaining the fiction that Isabella had simply self-destructed without any assistance from me. But Julian deserved better than lies, especially now." "Yes," I said simply. "I did. Why?" I thought about how to answer that question honestly. "Because she humiliated me in front of everyone we know. And because I could see that she was going to destroy you if she was given the chance. Because, sometimes, fathers have to protect their children from their own poor judgment." Julian was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the twilight settling over the garden. "I should be angry with you," he said finally. Yes, you probably should, but I'm not, because you were right about her, about everything. A wave of relief flooded through me. Relief that my son could forgive my manipulation, that he understood why I had felt compelled to act. I never wanted to hurt you, Julian. I only wanted to protect what matters most. I know, and I understand why you felt you had to do it that way. If you had simply told me your concerns, I would have defended her. I had to see the truth for myself. Your mother always said that the most important lessons can't be taught. They have to be experienced. Julian smiled sadly. She was right about a lot of things, wasn't she? Including the trust provisions. I used to think they were paranoid, but now you understand that protecting a legacy isn't just about money. It's about values, character, and the kind of people we allow into our inner circle. We finished our dinner in a comfortable silence. Two people who had weathered a storm and emerged with their relationship not just intact but stronger. As Julian was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. "What will you do now?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "You spent months orchestrating Isabella's downfall. Now that it's over, what's next for the mastermind?" I laughed at his description. "I think I'll return to what I do best, being your father and enjoying my garden, though perhaps with a bit more appreciation for both." After he left, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking the locks, the simple domestic rituals that marked the end of another day. In my study, I paused before Eleanor's portrait, as I did every night. She called me a beggar, I whispered to her painted image. But in the end, she was the one left with nothing. I opened the leather journal where I had been recording this strange chapter of my life and wrote the final entry. Justice served, legacy protected, family restored. Some battles are won, not through force, but through patience and the simple act of allowing people to reveal their true nature. Isabella Pierce destroyed herself more completely than I ever could have managed. I simply provided the stage for her performance. I closed the journal and placed it in the drawer next to the others. Volumes that chronicled business victories, personal triumphs, and the gradual building of a life worth protecting. This particular story would stand as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we build, but from what we preserve. 6 months later, I received an invitation that made me smile. Julian was engaged again, this time to Clara Chen, a pediatric surgeon he had met at a medical charity fundraiser. She was intelligent, accomplished in her own right, and most importantly, she treated others with a genuine kindness that couldn't be faked or taught. When I met her for the first time over lunch at the country club, she thanked me for raising such a thoughtful son and apologized for being nervous about meeting the legendary Arthur Harrington. "Legendary?" I asked, amused. "Julian told me you're the strongest man he knows," she said simply. "Someone who protects the people he loves without compromise." I liked her immediately. Their wedding was a much smaller affair than Julian's first. It was held in the garden of my estate, among the roses that Eleanor and I had planted decades ago, with only family and close friends in attendance. Clara wore a simple but elegant dress, and her grandmother's pearls. And when she promised to love and honor my son, I believed every single word. There was no cake incident this time. Just two people who genuinely loved each other, surrounded by people who genuinely loved them. As I watched them exchange vows under the rose arbor, I thought about the different paths that had led to this moment. Isabella's cruelty had taught Julian to value genuine kindness. Her greed had shown him the importance of finding someone who loved him for himself rather than for his bank account. Her public meltdowns had demonstrated the value of grace under pressure. In destroying herself, she had inadvertently led him to exactly the kind of woman he deserved. The irony was perfect. During the reception, as I watched Julian and Clara dance to the same song he and Isabella had chosen for their first dance, I felt a profound sense of completion. The wound that had been opened on that terrible night 2 years ago had finally healed, leaving behind not a scar, but wisdom. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the newlyweds had left for their honeymoon in Tuscany, I sat alone in my garden with a glass of champagne. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance perfuming the warm summer air, and the stars were brilliant overhead. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy with what you've done. You destroyed my life, Isabella." Even now, unable to accept responsibility for her own choices, I deleted the message without responding and put my phone away. Some people never learn that actions have consequences, that character determines destiny, that the seeds we plant inevitably determine the harvest we reap. I raised my glass to the night sky, to the memory of my beloved Eleanor, and to the future that stretched out ahead. A future where my family's legacy was secure, where my son was truly happy, and where I could finally rest in the knowledge that I had protected what mattered most. To patience, I whispered into the darkness, and to the understanding that the best revenge isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's simply allowing people to become exactly who they've always been. The roses nodded in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out across the estate that had witnessed so much history, so much love, and so much carefully orchestrated justice. I finished my champagne and went inside, turning off the lights one by one until only the stars remained to witness the perfect ending to an imperfect story. After all, some chapters close themselves. And that, everyone, is how I learned that true power isn't about fighting back. It's about having the patience to let others reveal who they really are. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced someone who underestimated your strength, or tried to diminish your worth, remember this: your story isn't over. You have more chapters to write, more victories to claim, and more wisdom to gain. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because everyone deserves to remember their own power. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person they never believed you could be. Until next time, this is Arthur Harrington.